Welcome to our learning community here on the Tunyamutwe platform. Typically, what we do is we talk about biological cells and the microbes that infect them in the language of Kikuyu, which is a language in central Kenya. So typically, we have these episodes on Thursday at 4 p.m., but then on Saturday, we usually have an English version or an English and Kiswahili version. Today, we're just going to have the English version. And so then what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about relaxers. And also someone asked us to also add on top of that bleaching cream. And then someone else mentioned this idea of the hair that we put on our heads, like the hair piece or hair extensions. So what I've done here is I've combined, or I'm going to use those three kind of concepts and examples to talk about one specific topic related to how cells grow and how cells function. So let's jump in. So as I said, here we talk about the different types of cells in the body. What you're looking at right now is a example diagram of the different types of cells that exist in the human body. But this is extrapolated to all living things or all multicellular things. And I want you to appreciate just how different the cells are. We also talk about microbes. And so this is bacteria and viruses, etc. And what you're looking at right now is just an image of different types of bacteria and how they look. And I want you to appreciate also just how different they are from each other and just how interesting this topic is. Today, though, we are not going to be talking so much about bacteria. What we're going to do is talk about cells and one of the things that impacts the way that cells stay healthy and how they stay functional. What we're going to do is talk about something that we do to kind of disrupt the way that these cells function. Let me say that. I think that's a better way to say it. So these things that I want to talk about, they fall in the category of like beauty and something that we do to make ourselves look more attractive or allegedly attractive. And so these are relaxers, the hair extensions, and bleaching cream. So I should say at this point that I'm not trying to shame anyone. I'm not trying to say that bleach, well, no, I think I will say that bleach is not great. But actually, I think all these topics, the outcome will be that they're not great. But I don't want to shame you. I think, in all seriousness, I don't want to shame anyone because I recognize that a lot of beauty standards that we operate with kind of require people to straighten their hair or to have extensions or to have certain skin tones, right? Because that is how the beauty standards are set up. And so I think I understand why people are compelled to apply relaxers and to bleach their skin, even though it's very, very harmful. So today's lesson is primarily for the purpose of education, not judgment, because I recognize the social pressures that require people to make these changes, right? So today is literally just a lesson, no judgment. And I don't want you to feel like you can judge someone else because I don't think we want to do that here. But this is just a lesson and I want to use this as an example because many of us have experience. Like I have had relaxers in my life. I have plaited my hair. I have never bleached my skin, but I know that there are many women and men that do. So I feel like these are concepts that are very relatable. And so I'm trying to use something that is relatable to draw a larger biology lesson. And so that's why I'm using this topic, not to judge, right? Okay, so the topic I want to talk about has to do with chemical signaling. And so this means the way that cells talk to each other. Hi, Franco. Hi, Anne. Thank you for being here. And so there's different types of ways that cells communicate with each other. So I want you to, we'll just go one step at a time. So the first type of method is called the autocrine communication system or chemical signaling system. And this is when a cell targets itself, meaning that the cell makes a signal or a chemical that then that chemical is used by the same cell to help itself grow or develop, or it has a certain signal. The second example of communication between cells is called signaling across gap junctions. So gap junctions are like doors. So when they're open, signals can go through. When they're closed, then the signal doesn't go through. And so this is a really interesting way for cells to kind of control their communication. Another type of signaling is called paracrine signaling. And this is when a cell targets a neighboring cell. And so then what's really interesting is that in this instance, proximity matters. So closeness matters, and that's how a signal moves from one place to another. Then the last example is called endocrine signaling. I bet that you have heard this term before. And so then this type of signaling is where a cell targets a distant cell through the bloodstream. And so this is relevant to us today because all of the things we're talking about are situations where we expose ourselves to chemicals by applying them onto our skin. And the thing is, the impact of these decisions or of applying or skin or hair. And the thing is, the impact of these decisions is not necessarily only seen at the skin level, it also is impacted in other organs. And so then how does the compound go from the skin to the organ? It goes through the blood. And so I want to highlight that this is a type of signaling that we will be primarily talking about today. And so then you can imagine that when you have too much signal, that can cause a problem. And then when you don't have any signal, that is another problem. And so then adding and introducing and modifying these signals by adding these external components can cause problems. And so that is really what we want to talk about today. How do relaxers and skin bleaching and these braids extensions, what is the relationship between those and signaling? And then how does it impact our daily lives? So if you remember, we had a lesson about cancer, and one of the things that we said is that when cells have trouble communicating with each other, one of the things they have trouble doing is they have trouble knowing when to stop growing. And what happens when cells do not stop growing? You can get a tumor. And what is a tumor? Tumor is one of the hallmarks of cancer. And so then when we think about how does cancer happen, or what are some ways that we can increase risk for cancer, the truth is some of the signaling pathways that these cells use to interact with each other, sometimes modifications to those can increase the risk of cancer. And that's why we talk about this topic today. So I have little stars to tell you that's kind of the type of signaling that we're going to discuss. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about research and work that has been done in those three categories. So in the category of relaxers, in the category of braiding, and in the category of skin bleaching. And we're going to talk about how those three different chemical signals or chemical substances have been related to cancer. And so that's what our lesson is today. So the first example has to do with a paper that was published in 2023. And the researchers sampled over 40,000 women between the year 1997 and 2019. And what they found was that there was an increased risk of uterine cancer. So this is cancer of the uterus among postmenopausal women. The thing is, before we go on, I should say that one thing that's in relaxers are a whole host of chemicals, including a chemical called parabens, or a type of chemicals called parabens, another type called phthalates, and then usually also formaldehyde. So parabens and phthalates are characteristically what they do is sometimes they will mimic hormones in the body. So they act as if they are hormones. And so you can imagine that disrupts some signaling because then your body has adjusted certain hormone levels, and then here you have another compound that is similar to the hormone. So that can cause some problem. And then formaldehyde, what it does is that it can disrupt your DNA. And we've talked about how DNA is a signal that is used to make the law of the cell. Like we've talked about mawado madero is how we talk about it in Kikuyu. But we talk about the fact that DNA contains instructions that help the cell function. And so then you can imagine if you mess that up somehow, then you can mess with something like signaling and all of these pathways that help the cells to grow. So this is one study that shows us a relationship between hair relaxers and increased risk of uterine cancer. Another study also studies over 40,000 women, and this was between 2003 and 2009. And this pool of women had a sister with, I think all of them had one sister with breast cancer, but they themselves did not have breast cancer. And so then what this study found was that there was a higher breast cancer risk with straightener and dye use, especially in Black women. And then the third example I want to cite is this one, which also studied over 40,000 women between 2003 and 2009. And what they found was frequent use of straighteners and relaxers were associated with increased ovarian cancer risk. So as we kind of think about this data and these observations, I want to remind you of two things. To focus on the fact that the cell locations that were cited in those studies are ovaries, breast, and uterus. And one thing that those organs have in common is they engage and use a lot of these hormones and signals, like in their daily function. And so then you can imagine that changing that via adding these relaxers that contain these hormone mimics, that can cause significant disruption. And perhaps, maybe that is one way you can understand the higher risk that someone is at when they use straighteners and dyes. I also want to stress this discussion. We talk a lot about cancer causing versus increased risk. So cancer is a very complex disease that has multiple reasons, right? And multiple causes. So it's very hard to just pinpoint one. But what is known is that there are many behaviors that can increase risk. And so that's why you hear, whenever I talk about it, and whenever, if you look at those studies, the researchers, they talk a lot about increasing risk versus causing, because it's very hard to pinpoint one cause. But you can kind of calculate and measure risk factors or things that increase likelihood, right? So that's why there's talk of risk. So I wanted to remind you of those two things. Okay, so we've talked about the relationship of hair relaxers and hair dyes and this higher risk of these cancers. So the second thing that we will discuss has to do with braiding hair. So there's this one report or this one commentary that highlights that there's a lot of chemicals that are found in synthetic hair that have been found to be carcinogenic. And in fact, so I'm going to link this below because I think you definitely should read it. And then there's a study that was conducted in 2020 that reported the presence of these compounds called volatile organic compounds from the fumes of hair that had been heated. So you can imagine the many instances where you heat synthetic hair. And so you can imagine that if you are exposing yourself to these extra toxic compounds, that is a problem, right? And so then the third place where I want to focus on, or the third kind of area that I will highlight today, has to do with skin bleaching. So these are two studies that I believe report one patient each. And what they do is they relate the use of these bleaching creams to the potential cancer of these two patients. And so then you might ask, okay, what is in skin bleaching cream that is causing cancer? So there's a bunch of compounds in skin bleaching creams that have been found to be problematic, including mercury, which is a heavy metal that causes lots and lots of disruptions in our organs. And it also causes neurological issues. And then also, it can cause developmental issues in children. And so this is a scenario where maybe you can apply this bleaching cream on yourself, and then maybe you pick up your child. So if you're doing that, then you might be exposing them to mercury. And so then I would say, because of the risk that is associated, or that shows up when we expose ourselves to mercury, Marley Lex, I would say no. I would say that bleaching cream has more problems than it has benefits. So another kind of potential harmful ingredient is hydroquinone. And so this is used in these compounds to treat, in these creams to treat pigment disorders by reducing the levels of melanin. But the problem is that it can also lead to neurological problems, and it is also potentially a carcinogen. The last potentially harmful ingredient is steroids. So steroids are hormone mimics. So they are typically used to treat skin conditions that include eczema or those type of disorders, and sometimes they will lighten your skin as a side effect. But the thing is, a steroid acts like a hormone. So if you're using too much of it, you might disrupt signaling and you might disrupt the function of your cells. So I think, taken together, the purpose of this lesson is to remind you and to highlight for you the fact that there are several things that you can do that can increase the risk of certain diseases and the risk of certain problems, specifically by how they impact your cells. So, again, I should close this by saying that I do not want to shame anybody because I recognize that beauty standards are set up a certain way and that we are all kind of subject to social pressure. But what I would like to remind you is that some of these decisions have very real health implications. And so, I urge you to consider the way that you interact with relaxers, the way that you interact with braiding hair, and the way that you interact with bleaching cream.